All righty. First of all, I got to say that we live in some very uncertain times, and that's what brought me to my current career. We need to have better dogs to deal with some elements of our new society, and I think as many speakers have talked about today, what has changed our breeds has been societal changes, and that's exactly where we're going at today. One thing I put an asterisk when we went up talking about maintaining genes and heritage for man's best working partner. We have to think about it as an ongoing process. I mainly work with Labrador retrievers, and I know even from that population we're looking at some very specific changes we're looking to make in those dogs. So though I need the heritage of the Labrador retriever, I also need to refine some of those traits that so many people have spoken very eloquently about today. First of all, who is this guy that's talking to you? From the bio, I've done a little bit of everything. I've spent 30 years in the working dog sport of Schutzhund and Mondio Ring. I spent about 6 years training marine mammals, dolphins, and sea lions. When I was at the University of Oklahoma, and I won't say I graduated from there because my dad would be really upset, I spent a lot of his money and I drank a lot of beer. But I did learn how to drive the Sooner Schooner, and so far Sooners are up 14-7 against Texas. Go Sooners. I'll be checking that as soon as I'm through speaking with you. But it's really important to understand that we have to have people who meet like this, who have a variety of backgrounds and understand animals from many, many different angles and understanding. I've learned more from training exotic birds, made me a much better dog trainer than training dogs, because if you upset a bird and he flies up a tree, there's nothing you can do but wait. But from that, it's made me more patient. It's made me aware of things that we're only starting to understand about dog and animal use now, and the fact that they do have emotional lives. This is something that was not discussed even 20 years ago. We just shuffled it over to the side. They do. A bird can tell you in many great ways how upset they are with you by turning their back to you while they sit on a limb. But from that, we have to understand that our dogs have those same components, and it's very, very important to us. Today's problem is a huge problem. We have a continual, global, rising need for working dogs. It's just growing out of proportion. We're looking at how we have shifted from working dogs to working dog trials. That's a big shift. Doug covered some of that information for us earlier about the availability of working dog trials. But now we have real needs for real working dogs for specific applications. We have that shift in function from a working dog to a family member and what the differences are there. We have a huge dependence in our country of being dependent on foreign vendors for all of our dogs because of some of these issues. We need to become less dependent. I don't want to say we want to eliminate that source because it's a rich source of some good genetic property, but at the same time, we need to be able to protect our own interests. We do not have any working trials for detection dogs. None. Doesn't exist. There are a couple police dog agencies that run trials to kind of prove the training more than it is to prove the genetics of the dogs. Traditional breeding to modern science is a big shift. We're seeing big changes in that area, and I think everybody's been made aware of that already this morning. As a nation, we have a lot of dogs, but very little guidance for breeding dogs for new uses, and we need to get better at that. I think I talk with many of my friends in the dog breeding community all the time about how do we save that stuff? How do we get it stuck aside so that we don't lose it over time? Currently, with the need for working dogs, we're looking at huge expenditures globally for more dogs. Government of India has looked into purchasing 300 million euros worth of dogs in the next 5 years. The UK just issued an article saying they'll be looking for $60 million of working dogs in Europe as well. The Marine Corps just signed a contract with an American vendor for $34 million worth of dogs to look for IEDs in Afghanistan and Iraq. The DHS just put out a statement of work. It's their contracting method, and they want 625 dogs a year for the next 5 years. And already with just those new purchases coming up, we have a growing existing need. I couldn't get exact numbers. We think the Department of Defense has probably 2,000 to 3,000 dogs out there in the field right now. Customs and Border Patrol has close to 1,000 dogs, and TSA has 700. Just the attrition rate of those dogs to replace is a huge number of dogs, and I just really don't know where they're coming from without finding a better way of doing this. I want to talk real briefly. I think Doug covered this fairly well, but we've had this huge shift from a working dog, in my example being the Labrador Retriever. He was hunting. He was bringing you food. And he was not only bringing you food, he was bringing himself food. And that proves, yes ma'am?
I hate to bug you, but can you go back to that first slide? That's a real important piece of information on that first slide that we just had.
Back up one.
Just back up one.
Yeah,
please.
go too fast.
Give us
Uh-oh.
just 2 minutes.
Okay.
Go down.
And that's just scratching the surface. There's more and more things. I know there's another contract out right now for ATF looking for dogs, and they've been spoiled by some of the service dogs. Schools have been providing their excess dogs, and now they can't get enough as well. So they're looking for a different kind of dog than some other people are, but at the same time, we see more and more of these contracts growing on a daily basis. Got it?
Some figures on Department of Defense, Customs, and Transit.
Yeah, I think Department of Defense has about 2,000 to 3,000 dogs. I couldn't find an exact number, and that's globally, dogs all across. Customs Border Patrol close to 1,000 dogs currently deployed and want to double that number. And TSA has 700 dogs located out in the field right now, and they're supposed to grow by at least half more within the next couple of years. As we look at the working dog trials, again, we're looking from that dog who has moved from a worker who's bringing food to your table. He's bringing food to himself. That has a whole different set of criteria than a working dog trial. I think Doug did an excellent job of describing the retriever field trial. The retriever field trial honors the dog and titles the dog who goes from point A to point B as quickly and as in straight a line as they can and come back. That's wonderful. The problem with that is we're starting to de-emphasize the olfactory acuity. They definitely have to get there on the blind retrieve, but we're de-emphasizing the true use of that nose in that dog by strictly looking at the genetics of the field trial. My dilemma is when I breed dogs into my bloodlines, the field trial dog does by far more than the master hunter, the senior hunter, the junior hunter all day long. So we have to have better methods for finding these dogs and figuring out how to get better dogs. One of the charts I've put out over and over trying to explain how difficult it is to find these dogs is looking at the availability of Labrador Retrievers in the United States. If we consider there are 1 million Labradors in the United States of breeding age right now, once we've taken those dogs and squeezed them down by age, whether they pass the CHIC, do they have cleared hips, elbows, and eyes? And now we have to add to that because of the problems within the Labrador, exercise-induced collapse, central nuclear myopathy, make sure they're screened for all that. How much they want to sell the dog for, and the government's never easy about buying things. They tell breeders stuff like, well, we'll pay you $2,500 for a breeding quality animal. We'll pay you in 6 months if you take a credit card, and a year if you'll take a check. And by the way, we get to squeeze the dog for everything we want to do for that entire time, and then we can return it to you. Nobody wants to play the game. So the availability of those dogs is even more difficult when we start looking at that. Additionally, we add on to that the field trial requirement, because that seems to be the genetics for a true working dog. And it's a real small number of dogs out of that 1 million that earn a field trial championship or an amateur field trial championship, maybe 200 dogs a year. So it's a very small number. And some of those dogs may be repeating titles. And even when we look from the field trial champion to the amateur field trial champion, it's probably the same dog getting titled in each one. So we can take that $1 million dogs, and I can reduce it to about 200 dogs pretty quickly based on looking at some of those schemes. So I have to find all of those 200 dogs and figure out how to put them back in the system. Obviously, we have a big shift from function to family member. That poor dog, it's just horrible to make him look like a starship. I guess you can't see it there. The Vizsla in the bottom right-hand corner is one of our dogs, and that's just classic Vizsla. We're raising a Vizsla litter right now, and they're so laid back, and everybody likes to play with them because unlike the Labradors, they're not pulling your pant legs and untying your shoes. But we have this big shift from actual function to that family member. And it is real important, as some of the earlier speakers mentioned, that we can identify that a dog can be a working animal. He can spend his life working and being productive to us. The vast majority of the time that they do that, they become very close with their handlers. They make a big bond, the same bond, if not sometimes a greater bond than we'll have with pets. The dependency on foreign vendors, originally in the United States, all the dogs came from the United States. We have multiple programs that have continued to supply dogs to the United States. We had a breeding program in the late 60s, early 70s. We've done it over and over, but we made a shift. And at one point we made a shift to buying dogs from mainly the European vendors. And when we did that, we kind of got used to it. There was a ready supply of dogs available all the time. The main reason for that is they have a rich and long tradition of police dog trials. And with that, they are breeding the dogs for these sports people all the time, and therefore they have a huge number of dogs to pick from. The basic breeder over there wants to make a breeding to pick his next generation sport dog, but he's left over with 6, 7, 8 more puppies. They've got to go somewhere and are usually put off to some vendor to train up and try to push them off onto somebody to purchase. There is a huge population. It just kills me that all of Europe, which fit in the state of Texas, can supply more dogs than our vast nation. It doesn't make sense to me at all. And the other thing is that's starting to fade now is the historic power of the U.S. dollar. We got to buy at least second or third tier dogs. Only the richest countries get the best dogs. And that's starting to fade as well. And particularly now, if the European vendors find out about all these requirements for all these new dogs, I guarantee the price will start climbing dramatically. I've seen about a $3,000 increase in 3 months for a single-purpose detection dog on some of the government sites. The European Dog Sports KMPV, I won't try to pronounce it. I think it stands for Royal Dutch Police Dog. It's more of a certification than a true sport, but has supplied a huge number of dogs for dual-purpose use, the protection as well as the detection dog. The same with the Belgian ring, French ring, Mondial ring, Schutzhund, and IPO. There's so much of that going on in Europe that we have a constant supply of these dogs being bred. The very unique thing, though, is that even within those populations and those dog sports, the dogs become unique one more time because the sport, as the environment, starts defining the genetics of the dog. A Belgian ring dog can do things a French ring dog just couldn't even possibly accomplish. They have to have much stronger nerve. And so we're starting to see even these separations starting to go out there. One of the most recent statement of works was suggesting that the Secret Service only wanted the KMPV dog, and they're no longer interested in the Schutzhund style dog that has been famous for and used for so long. Does purpose-based breeding work? It does. It works all day long. We have so many models of it. First thing we know is traditional breeding has worked, it continues to work. The guide dog schools have given us so much information. I'm so happy to have friends like Paul Mundell, Eldon Layton, Jane Russenberger. These kind of individuals have shared a huge amount of information with me over 9 years, and that allows me to know what mistakes not to repeat and to be careful in my breeding program. The service dog programs have been extremely important. We continue to see a huge amount of diversification now that we're looking at dogs that are helping people with mobility, and the therapy dogs, it's just growing every day. Canine Biosensor was a program established by the United States Army. They bred dogs for a number of years and did a pretty good job, and the data looks extremely good, but unfortunately they started looking at generating them at costs that were just way too high for the period of time and what we thought a dog was worth, and those figures are probably laughable today, and I wish they would have continued their work. Australian Customs started breeding dogs in 1992. Basically, they had the belief system originally in Australian Customs they could travel all over Australia and get free dogs. Somebody finally added up and realized that if you drive all over Australia, you're spending thousands of dollars. And if you look at 100, 200, 300, 500 dogs to find one free dog, you've spent a whole lot of money. A gentleman in Australia decided at one point to tell his bosses, if we're spending all this money, why don't we look at spending this money on breeding dogs and see if that's a viable alternative? He has done that job. He now supplies all the dogs for Australian Customs. I think his total requirement for Australian Customs is 30 to 60 dogs a year. The program breeds about 250 dogs a year because of the global demand for these dogs in that portion of the world. Royal Canadian Mounted Police, another great example of German Shepherd breeders that have worked hard and done the hard homework you need to do. Royal Australian Air Force, Paul Mundell and myself get bugged by one of their sergeants, I think, on a bi-weekly basis. But it keeps the conversation open in order to be able to figure out how we can help one another. The South African police dog is another great and excellent model. I think they've been breeding dogs since 1932, 5 or 6 different breeds. I think they do 600 dogs a year and have all kinds of different breeds and modalities for the purposes of their program. And it shows us over and over that using the purpose breeding model works, and it works very, very well. Does traditional breeding work? Well, yes. I mean, we can see easily that it works. Just as it was described earlier, we've got a huge amount of genetic variation. As demonstrated in that picture, we can see this variation from the Great Dane to the Chihuahua. But along with that phenotypical variation in size, we also have a phenotypical variation in behavior. And it is drawing upon those behaviors that will allow us to make better and better dogs for new purposes as we move into the future. As we move from that traditional model, we got to start thinking about the science. And every time we speak in one of these audiences, and maybe somebody asks a question about methylation, I'm sorry, we will start to wonder about how the science works. We have to think that way. I think for years we've made apologies for saying, you know, I don't want to confuse you with the science. Everyone needs to know the science. We need to know that there are better ways of doing this. We need to move to that model to get away from the old feeling of, well, I like this dog and she's pretty, and I like this dog and he's got a big chest. We'll put them together and they'll make great puppies. There's better ways of doing that. Some of the things demonstrated on the chart, Waddington's epigenetic principle was done, I think, in the 40s. And basically he was saying, you know, we all start out genetically with that P up in that valley where it looks like we're kind of centered, but there's multiple choices of where we're going to roll down from epigenetic change. Epigenetic change can happen from learning. It can happen from DNA changing. There's a number of things. Even when he did the first model, they had problems with it and looked at the second model. And when I look at that second model, I think a lot about what Meg was talking about earlier. When we start thinking about some of these neurochemical influences, we have these pulleys and ropes shifting those valleys all over the place, trying to figure out what the final outcome is going to be based on how these animals are raised and how we're interacting with these animals. The last figure on the bottom is the formula for heritability. I couldn't explain it to you. I would ask one of the more esteemed colleagues here about how that works. But that's what it takes. If we continue with some of the simpler models, it makes it more and more difficult to make that better dog in our future. My question about methylation. This is some of the more recent research on methylation. It was done with rats. A lot of people, when we talk about rats and voles and everything, you got to understand the reason we look at that is it's an early form of mammal. It lets us know what we can do. When they looked at some licking and grooming behavior of mother rats to their infants, they noticed there was some profound changes in those infants. And this licking and grooming behavior changed the infant's response to reward, changed their response to their thinking processes and cognition, and it changed their response to stress. The babies that were taken better care of and licked and groomed more ended up being easier to work with in a lot of ways than the ones that were not, that had the fearful mothers. Now, the trick to this is not only does it just change them behaviorally, we can all accept that, we've all been raised good, we're good. The problem is it changes the DNA as well through that process of methylation. It literally silences some genes that might make for a fear and escape pattern in order to create an animal that's a little bit more tractable. And that stuff doesn't even just change in those children, but those children's children. So it's an amazing process. And I heard Gail Smith at the University of Pennsylvania earlier this year say he thought that could make up to a 500-fold change in outcomes when we start looking at some of the epigenetic processes on how we're going to make sure not only that we've done a good genetic job, but we've done a good job in other ways as well. TSA'S Canine Breeding and Development Center started in 1999. Typical of a government program, they decided not to breed dogs for 2 years. I can't make a lot of sense of it. There was a lot of politics involved. Quite literally, there was a breeding conference being held at Lackland Air Force Base during the events of 9/11. They wheeled in the TVs. Everybody thought it was kind of somebody putting them on to see if they would make more discussion about the seriousness of breeding dogs. And then everybody figured out pretty quickly that our world had changed dramatically. The gentleman that supplied us with our original breeding stock in 1999 stood up and said, I think you should start breeding dogs now. And we bred the first litter a month later, and they were born in the beginning of 2002. Since that time, we've bred about 470 dogs. Mostly Labrador Retrievers. I see the most success I can make genetically is in Labrador Retrievers. We've had some work with the Vizslas because of a strong preference for them, but so far it's a horrible genetic experiment just based on the availability and types of dogs that we've had to access. Additionally, we have a huge health standard. Obviously, we want to do hips. I will only use the Penn hip system. I'd be glad to discuss that with anybody later, but it works, and it works extremely efficiently. Elbows and eyes are done by the United States Army Veterinary Corps people to make sure that we've done good eyes. And now we've added genetic screening for both C&M and EIC to make sure we have a completely healthy population as we get started. I know that's a lot of information, but this is how it needs to start being looked at instead of the simple thing of, I like this dog, I like that dog, let's try to put them together. We've got a whole bunch of contingencies at work on how to do this. You have to figure out how you're going to select your breeding stock, what measurements you're going to use for your breeding stock, how you're going to develop those dogs correctly, what genetics you're going to combine, how you're going to breed and raise them. Breeding and raising mechanisms, we currently have multiple different models. We have to consider the molecular genetics, we have to consider the population genetics, we have to consider quantitative genetics, and that gives us a whole bunch of tools that have great acronyms like BLUPs and QTLs and EBVs, but these things are becoming more and more important. I had a breeding program manager about a year ago ask me why did she think it was important for me to do inbreeding coefficients. But the inbreeding coefficients are extremely important. We've got the software out there. You don't have to be a genius. Boy, you just punch it into the pedigree software and it comes right back out. But it certainly helps you manage your ability to make sure you're maintaining the genetic diversity within your population and keeping the traits you want to do. And most of that's done with the quantitative genetics. Additionally, we're starting to look at all the neurobiological substrates. Meg touched on that pretty well. I mean, we have dopamine as a huge thing. Serotonin playing into it, but all these things are becoming more and more important, and we have to understand genetically how to influence those things. And those things not only have neuroplastic effects like learning to affect them, but they also have the epigenetic effects like methylations. They're very, very important. And again, I think the big chart on the far side is one I always try to sell my boss on. You can't do any of that unless you have money and facilities and staff, and that's always a battle. Within our program, the basic genetic stuff we're looking for is we do testing at 3, 6, 9, and 12 months. The first thing we look for is chase retrieve. You take a towel, you throw it at an open field. Anybody want to guess how many Labradors run out and grab a towel thrown out in an open field? It's like it's about 99. Every once in a while we'll see one and just be shocked. They'll all do it. And it's funny because when we've looked at that trait of chase retrieve through quantitative genetics, it doesn't prove to be heritable. It doesn't mean it's not heritable, it just means it's a completely fixed trait. All Labrador Retrievers chase things that are thrown. The second thing we look at is independent possession, their desire to possess that object, run around, carry it. When I have a dog brings it back and drops it at my foot, I start to cry. I want a dog who's going to keep it and run away, and I've got to run away from him and get him to run up to me and pet him and praise him and let him know that was a great job. The physical possessions demonstrated in the picture the ability to play tug of war. And that's very important. Both the independent possession and the physical possession has been proven by quantitative trait analysis within our population to be highly heritable. So we continue to select for that. And that's great because that's actually what the training staff really would like to see more of. Mental possession is the dog's ability to fixate on the game. What are they doing? Where are they hiding these things? Where are they going with that thing? We haven't found any heritabilities with it, but we continue to measure it to give us a sense of the dogs that have a better idea. Then we test hidden grass. We'll take the towel, we'll throw it into some tall grass to see if they can find it when they can't see it. Can they use their nose a little bit? Our frustration is we live on an Air Force base where they pay people to mow grass all the time, so finding tall grass is extremely difficult. Then we'll take the towel and we'll hide it underneath a series of overturned flower pots and see what the dog's ability. And it's just absolutely shocking how good dogs can be at this. We've literally seen puppies as young as 12 weeks of age travel through a scent cone of odor, turn directly into it, flip the pot over, and take the towel. My first second filler generation litter was working that way years ago, and we were also raising some puppies from Guiding Eyes for the Blind. The Guiding Eyes for the Blind puppies were magnificent in their environmental stability, everything I could ever ask for. But when they would walk by those pots, they hadn't a clue. They had no idea. It was almost embarrassing to watch them do it. But these dogs have been selected over a long period of time to not be attracted or distracted by an odor. And the fine line exists between what is attracted to an odor and what is distracted by an odor. They had great success at guiding eyes, putting dogs with the ATF. The ATF was doing strict food reward, and with that, it wasn't as big an issue for them to see as what we're looking for in the dogs wanting to find the toy. Environmental stability, we basically look at a few measures. Confidence, and confidence is rated against fear. A dog that gets a 5 in confidence didn't show any fearful responses. We're looking at that carefully. We look at those at 3, 6, 9, and 12 months. We use real-world environments. I don't believe in little testing grids and little quiet rooms. I want to put them out in the real world where things can go wrong. So we look at the confidence. Do they show fearful responses? With puppies, an overhead announcement can just fry them. They're not sure what that meant. And we're looking at their ability to recover to any one of those individual responses. Their concentration, do they kind of stay on task, keep going? Do they lock up? Are they pulling ahead, going crazy? Responsiveness, if we try to give them a gentle pop on a flat collar, do they respond to that? Or if we're trying to praise them, do they show us good response to that? The dog's initiative is also extremely important, especially when they're getting close to 9 and 12 months of age and they're testing. I want to see a dog who's already searching on his own. He's been doing that the majority of his life, and we want to see him continue that. And we also look at body sensitivity in the dogs along with hearing sensitivity. We did do gunfire testing with the Labradors early in. We haven't done it since, but the kennel I have has cannon and machine gun fire on either side of it and jets that go overhead, so I'm not too worried about the noise issues.